You have been taught, from the moment you learn to obey, that dignity is something granted, bestowed from above, distributed by those who own, govern, and command. You have been told that rights must be earned through submission, that survival itself is a privilege, and that questioning the order of things is an act of ingratitude. This is the first and most enduring lie of class society. Dignity is not a gift. It is not a reward. It is not something to be requested from those who profit from your silence. Dignity is a human necessity, and any system that requires permission to be human is already guilty of tyranny. Look closely at the world you inhabit. It parades itself as natural, inevitable, eternal. Yet everywhere you see contradiction. Those who labor the longest live the shortest lives of rest. Those who create the wealth possess the least of it. Those whose hands build the cities cannot afford to dwell within them. This is not accident, incompetence, or moral failure. It is design. Capitalism does not fail to deliver dignity. It functions precisely by denying it. Under this system, labor is reduced to a commodity, measured not by its humanity but by its profitability. The worker appears free, yet this freedom is hollow, free only to sell their labor or to starve. The wage conceals exploitation, masking unpaid labor as fairness, disguising domination as contract. The more wealth the worker produces, the poorer they become in relation to the power that confronts them. This is the central antagonism of modern society, between those who own the means of production and those who possess nothing but their capacity to work. The ruling class insists that patience is virtue, that suffering is temporary, that progress will one day trickle downward. But history exposes this as ideology, not truth. No ruling class has ever surrendered power voluntarily. No system built on exploitation has ever humanized itself out of goodwill. Every advance made by the oppressed has been torn from the hands of power through struggle, organization, and resistance. Dignity has never been given. It has always been seized. You are told to be grateful for wages that barely sustain life, for rights that vanish when profit is threatened, for representation that serves capital before people. You are told that collective action is dangerous, that solidarity is unrealistic, that resistance is futile. These narratives are not neutral. They are instruments of control, designed to fragment the working class, to turn worker against worker, nation against nation, so that exploitation may continue undisturbed. Division is the shield of capital. But the worker is not weak by nature. Powerlessness is imposed. When isolated, the worker appears small. When united, the worker becomes history's most transformative force. Every factory, every office, every field, every machine already testifies to this truth. Capital is dead labor that lives only by consuming living labor. Without the worker, the system collapses. The realization of this fact is the beginning of class consciousness, and consciousness is the most dangerous force the oppressed can possess. To demand dignity, then, is not to beg for reform within an unjust order. It is to expose the order itself as unjust. It is to refuse the logic that equates human worth with market value. It is to declare that life exists for more than profit, that labor exists for human fulfillment, not endless accumulation. This demand threatens the foundations of capitalism because it challenges its sacred principle, that everything, including human beings, must serve capital. The state, presenting itself as neutral, stands guard over this arrangement. Its laws sanctify property over life, its institutions manage inequality rather than abolish it. While it speaks the language of freedom, it enforces the conditions of exploitation. This is not a conspiracy but a function. The state arises from irreconcilable class antagonisms and serves the interests of the dominant class while claiming universality. To understand this is not cynicism, it is clarity. Yet history does not end with domination. The same contradictions that sustain capitalism also undermine it. As exploitation intensifies, so does awareness. As wealth concentrates, resistance spreads. The working class, forged by the very system that oppresses it, carries within itself the capacity to overthrow that system. This is not a matter of morality but of material reality. A society that cannot reproduce dignity cannot reproduce itself forever. Do not ask whether you are allowed to demand dignity. Ask instead why a system exists that requires your permission to live fully. Do not wait for leaders who promise change without conflict or reforms that leave exploitation intact. Emancipation is not an event delivered from above. It is a process carried out collectively from below. Organization is not optional, it is essential. Solidarity is not idealism, it is survival. The struggle for dignity is the struggle to reclaim your humanity from a system that feeds on it. It is the struggle to transform social relations, to abolish conditions in which one class lives from the labor of another. This struggle will be resisted, distorted, criminalized. That resistance is proof of its necessity. You do not need permission to demand dignity because dignity is incompatible with exploitation. To demand it is to challenge the very structure of class society. And in that challenge lies the possibility of a world in which human beings are no longer means to an end, but ends in themselves. Dignity is not a currency to be exchanged, nor is it a privilege to be awarded by those who hold power over society. It is not a concession that the rich, the powerful, or the ruling class can bestow upon the masses at their discretion. To speak of dignity as something that must be granted is to misunderstand the very essence of human existence. Every human being, by virtue of being human, possesses an inherent worth that cannot be measured in money, status, or social recognition. This worth exists independently of the opinions of those who dominate the economic, political, and social structures of the world. Yet, under systems of exploitation and hierarchy, the ruling class has sought to redefine dignity as a conditional concept, something to be earned through obedience, submission, or acquiescence to established authority. This manipulation creates a false sense of hierarchy, teaching the oppressed to believe that their value depends on the approval of those who benefit from their labor, while denying them the full realization of their humanity. The commodification of labor under capitalism is one of the most egregious mechanisms through which this falsehood is maintained. Workers are asked to sell their capacity to work, their creativity, their time, and their very energy. And in return, they are given wages that barely sustain life, all while the wealth they generate accumulates in the hands of a tiny minority. The system implicitly communicates that the laborer's dignity is secondary to profit, that human life itself is subordinate to accumulation. In this way, the notion that dignity must be granted by the powerful serves to normalize inequality, to obscure the structural violence inherent in the economic system, and to encourage self-blame among the oppressed for conditions they did not create. To recognize dignity as inherent is to challenge this entire framework. It is to affirm that every individual, regardless of social status, race, gender, occupation, or wealth, is entitled to respect, to agency, and to the conditions necessary for a life of meaning. Inherent dignity is universal and inalienable. It cannot be suspended or revoked by law, by custom, or by the whims of rulers. The acknowledgement of this fact has profound implications for the relationship between the oppressed and those who govern them. It undermines the moral authority of the powerful, exposing the system of domination as artificial, contingent, and morally illegitimate. When dignity is recognized as intrinsic, the very act of labor, the act of creating, producing, and sustaining life, becomes a source of empowerment rather than subjugation. The worker no longer perceives herself as merely a tool for profit, but as a human being whose labor and existence carry value in themselves. This understanding transforms the consciousness of the oppressed, fostering self-respect, collective awareness, and a refusal to accept subordination as natural or inevitable. Throughout history, systems of exploitation have relied on the illusion that the marginalized must ask permission to live fully, that their basic needs and rights are contingent upon the consent of the ruling class. The legal systems, the cultural norms, and even the education systems often reinforce the idea that dignity is a favor, a concession, or a privilege extended to those who conform. When people internalize this ideology, they accept conditions of injustice, inequality, and deprivation as normal. They learn to negotiate for scraps rather than demand the fullness of their human rights. To insist that dignity is inherent is to reject this internalized oppression and to assert that human beings are not dependent on the moral benevolence of the powerful. It is to insist that respect, recognition, and the capacity to shape one's own life cannot be outsourced to authorities or postponed indefinitely. This recognition also forms the foundation of collective struggle. When individuals understand that their dignity is not contingent, they are no longer isolated by fear, shame, or self-doubt. They begin to see themselves as part of a broader community of human beings who share the same intrinsic worth and the same right to live with freedom, respect, and security. Inherent dignity is therefore both personal and political. It is personal in the sense that each individual must claim it for themselves, refusing to accept the moral subordination that capitalism and hierarchy impose. It is political because it undermines the legitimacy of systems that deny human value in favor of profit, status, or domination, creating the basis for collective resistance. Recognizing dignity as inherent destabilizes the very premise on which exploitation relies. The notion that the oppressed must negotiate for their own humanity, that they must accept the terms set by those who profit from their labor. It makes clear that inequality is not natural, that hierarchy is not divinely ordained, and that the denial of human worth is a conscious social and economic construction designed to maintain control. To embrace this understanding is to reject passivity, to refuse subjugation, and to embrace the radical idea that the worth of human life cannot and must not be conditional. It transforms the consciousness of the oppressed, equips them with moral clarity, and forms the foundation for the struggle to create a society in which dignity is not a favor but a reality experienced by all. Capitalism, in its essence, is a system built upon the extraction of surplus value from the labor of the working class. It presents itself as a natural order of production and exchange, as though the inequalities it generates are inevitable outcomes of human nature rather than constructed mechanisms of domination. Under capitalism, labor is not recognized as the creative, human force that sustains life and society. Instead, it is reduced to a mere commodity, a quantifiable input whose value is determined not by its contribution to human flourishing, but by its capacity to generate profit. The worker in this system becomes an instrument, a vehicle through which capital grows, while the fruits of that labor are expropriated by those who own the means of production. From the very moment the worker enters the factory, the office, or the field, their energy, time, and skill are measured, bought, and sold as if they were inert goods, devoid of human dignity, complexity, and autonomy. The wage, which is presented as fair compensation, is in fact a fraction of the value the worker produces. The remainder, the surplus, is appropriated by capitalists as profit. This is the fundamental exploitation upon which capitalism rests, the difference between what labor produces and what labor receives. It is a system that requires, by its very nature, the continuous extraction of value from human beings, and the legitimacy of the system is maintained through ideology, legal structures, and cultural narratives that normalize inequality and obscure the reality of exploitation. Capitalism thrives on this invisibility, on the workers' perception that the wage they receive is a fair exchange, when in fact it is the product of expropriated human effort. It transforms the vital, creative energy of labor into an abstract calculation, stripping work of its humanity and converting human life into a means for the accumulation of wealth. Beyond the economic mechanics, the commodification of labor carries profound social and psychological consequences. Workers are encouraged to identify with their roles as producers for capital rather than as human beings with intrinsic worth and agency. Their creativity is subordinated to the imperatives of efficiency, productivity, and profitability. The system rewards compliance, discourages solidarity, and pits worker against worker through competition, precarious employment, and the illusion of meritocracy. In doing so, capitalism reproduces itself not merely through economic structures, but through the shaping of consciousness, ensuring that the exploited internalize their subordination as normal, natural, and necessary. The commodification of labor extends beyond mere physical or intellectual effort. Time itself becomes a commodity, reduced to hours and minutes that can be bought and sold. Leisure, rest, and personal development are subordinated to the relentless imperatives of production. Workers are compelled to sell not only their labor but also their autonomy, their dignity, and often their health for survival. The system transforms the fundamental conditions of human existence into instruments of profit, measuring life in terms of productivity rather than value, efficiency rather than fulfillment. Within this structure, social inequality is both produced and justified. The accumulation of wealth by the few is presented as the reward for entrepreneurship, innovation, or merit, while the structural exploitation of the many is portrayed as incidental or necessary. The ruling class maintains control not only through ownership, but also through ideology, the assertion that markets are neutral, that competition is natural, that inequality is inevitable. This masks the reality that the wealth of the few is directly contingent upon the uncompensated labor of the many, and that capitalism, in practice, is a system designed to concentrate resources and power rather than distribute them equitably. Moreover, the system enforces a hierarchy in which the value of labor is constantly evaluated against profitability rather than human necessity. Work that generates profit is valued and rewarded, while work that sustains life, care work, creative pursuits, and communal contributions are often undervalued or rendered invisible. This reveals the moral bankruptcy inherent in treating human labor as a commodity. The worth of human beings is subordinated to the demands of accumulation, and the social good is measured not by collective well-being, but by the concentration of capital. The exploitation at the core of capitalism is not merely a byproduct, but its driving force. Without the extraction of surplus value from labor, the system would collapse. Every enterprise, every factory, every service, every market relies upon the continual appropriation of human effort for private gain. This structural reality explains why reforms alone cannot resolve inequality. The system is not malfunctioning, it is functioning according to its design. To understand capitalism is to recognize that the commodification of labor is both an economic necessity for the system and a mechanism of social control. It disciplines workers, shapes desires, and enforces dependency, while simultaneously producing the illusion of freedom and choice. Workers are free to sell their labor, yet they are constrained by the conditions of survival, the pressure of market forces, and the social expectation that they accept exploitation as normal. The contradictions are stark. Labor is simultaneously essential and devalued, life-producing and undercompensated, human and commodified. Recognizing this exploitation is not merely an intellectual exercise but a moral imperative. It reveals the fundamental injustice embedded in the system and provides the basis for collective action. By understanding that capitalism thrives precisely by turning labor into a commodity, workers can begin to see themselves not as isolated individuals competing for scraps, but as part of a collective force whose labor sustains society and whose power, if united, can challenge the structures of domination, confront inequality, and reclaim the full value of human work. True change does not emerge spontaneously from individual effort or moral persuasion. It does not arrive as a gift from those who benefit from existing hierarchies, nor can it be secured through incremental reforms that leave the underlying structures of exploitation intact. To achieve lasting transformation, the oppressed must recognize that their circumstances are not the result of personal failure, misfortune, or chance, but the product of systemic arrangements designed to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a few while subordinating the majority. This recognition is the foundation of class consciousness, the understanding that society is divided into antagonistic classes whose interests are inherently opposed. Without this awareness, the working class and the marginalized are left vulnerable to manipulation, false promises, and divisions intentionally sowed by those who profit from their labor. Class consciousness is not merely an abstract idea, it is the lived awareness of one's position within the relations of production. The realization that the labor one performs creates wealth that one does not control, and that this exploitation is systemic rather than accidental. It involves understanding that individual suffering is connected to collective conditions, that personal deprivation is intertwined with the structural mechanisms of oppression. This awareness fuels the capacity for organized resistance, for coordinated action that challenges the power of the ruling class and exposes the injustices built into economic and political institutions. Collective organization is the practical manifestation of class consciousness. It transforms individual grievances into a shared struggle, allowing the oppressed to wield their strength not as isolated fragments but as a united force capable of confronting entrenched power. History demonstrates that no ruling class relinquishes its privilege voluntarily, and no system founded on inequality can be dismantled without coordinated effort. Strikes, unions, political movements, and revolutionary organizations are not mere strategies. They are necessary instruments through which the working class asserts its collective power and demands systemic change. Organization ensures that individual effort is amplified, that scattered discontent is transformed into a coherent, strategic force, and that the oppressed can negotiate, resist, and ultimately seize the conditions necessary for human dignity. Without it, the laboring masses are easily divided, pitted against one another through ideology, prejudice, and competition, preventing the emergence of the solidarity required for true transformation. Class consciousness and collective organization reinforce one another. Awareness of shared exploitation motivates collective action, and participation in collective struggle sharpens understanding of the systemic nature of oppression. As individuals experience solidarity, as they recognize that their strength lies not in isolation but in union with others, their perception of power shifts. They see that the system that dominates them is not invincible, that the structures of authority and wealth depend entirely on their continued compliance, and that collective resistance can challenge, disrupt, and ultimately overturn the established order. Moreover, the cultivation of class consciousness requires education, dialogue, and critical engagement with the realities of economic and social life. It demands analysis of the laws, institutions, and cultural narratives that normalize inequality, as well as the historical conditions that have shaped the present balance of power. This intellectual engagement is inseparable from practical struggle, for theory alone cannot change conditions, but neither can action be effective without understanding. Workers and oppressed groups must learn to recognize the mechanisms of exploitation, to trace the connections between their labor, their wages, and the accumulation of wealth by the ruling class. They must understand the ways in which false ideologies, meritocracy, individualism, nationalism, and consumer culture obscure the reality of class relations and prevent solidarity. Only through this combination of understanding and organization can meaningful resistance emerge. Collective organization also transforms consciousness itself. Participation in struggle teaches discipline, cooperation, and strategic thinking, while fostering a sense of mutual responsibility and shared purpose. It nurtures confidence, empowerment, and the understanding that change is possible, that the system depends upon the acquiescence of the many, and that by asserting their rights together, the oppressed can alter the balance of power. True change, therefore, is inseparable from the processes of both thought and action, the intellectual clarity of recognizing systemic exploitation, and the practical coordination necessary to confront it. Reforms imposed without such awareness are fragile, easily reversed, and often co-opted to preserve the status quo. Transformations rooted in class consciousness and collective organization, by contrast, challenge the foundations of exploitation itself, confronting the structures that perpetuate inequality and creating the conditions for lasting social, economic, and political emancipation. To ignore either element is to accept the illusion of progress without achieving liberation, for fragmented effort, uncoordinated action, or isolated awareness cannot dismantle a system built upon centuries of concentrated power, nor can it secure the rights, dignity, and freedom of those who labor. It is through the interdependence of understanding and collective effort, through the unification of consciousness and organization, that the oppressed discover their true strength, articulate their demands, and transform society from one of domination to one grounded in equity, justice, and human fulfillment. Class consciousness awakens the recognition that the emancipation of one is bound to the emancipation of all, that personal freedom is inseparable from collective liberation, and that only by joining together in common purpose can the structures of oppression be confronted, dismantled, and replaced with a society that honors the inherent worth, rights, and dignity of every individual. The state is often presented as a neutral arbiter, a guardian of law and order, and a protector of all citizens alike. It claims to uphold justice, to mediate conflicts, and to provide a framework in which society can function harmoniously. Yet beneath this veneer of impartiality lies a structure designed to preserve the power and privilege of the ruling class. The state does not exist to serve the common good in an abstract or universal sense. It exists as an instrument of social control, ensuring that the existing relations of production, wealth, and authority remain unchallenged. Laws, policies, and institutions that are proclaimed as neutral are, in reality, mechanisms through which inequality is maintained and reinforced. Property rights, for example, are protected rigorously, not because they are inherently sacred, but because they uphold the interests of those who own the means of production. Those who possess capital are shielded by the legal system from the consequences of exploitation, while those who labor for a wage are subject to the strictures of contracts, taxation, and regulation that limit their autonomy and mobility. The state enforces this inequality through its monopoly on violence, both overt and subtle. Police, courts, and prisons function not merely to prevent crime, but to suppress dissent and protect the property and privileges of the elite. When workers strike, protest, or resist exploitation, they encounter a legal and coercive apparatus that frames their actions as illegitimate, criminal, or dangerous. Meanwhile, corporate malfeasance, financial manipulation, and environmental destruction by powerful entities are often met with minimal consequences, demonstrating the selective application of law and authority in favor of those who control wealth. Education, healthcare, and welfare systems, when they exist, are structured in ways that reproduce social hierarchies rather than dismantle them. Access to quality schooling, professional advancement, and social mobility is mediated by wealth and social connections, ensuring that privilege is inherited and perpetuated. The state, in this sense, acts as a stabilizing force for the dominant class, creating the illusion of fairness while codifying and enforcing the structural advantages that secure their position. Ideology and culture play complementary roles in this enforcement. The state promotes narratives that normalize inequality, framing the success of the few as meritocratic and the deprivation of the many as a natural consequence of individual effort or moral failing. These narratives mask systemic exploitation and encourage the oppressed to internalize blame for conditions imposed upon them by the economic and political structure. Through media, education, and law, the state cultivates consent, persuading the majority to accept their subordination as inevitable, natural, or even desirable. The enforcement of inequality is not solely economic but political. Electoral systems, legislative procedures, and bureaucratic institutions are structured in ways that favor entrenched interests, making it exceedingly difficult for the working class and marginalized groups to achieve meaningful representation or influence policy. Campaign finance, lobbying, and legislative capture ensure that laws are created and enforced in ways that perpetuate wealth concentration, limit redistribution, and maintain the dominance of elites over social and economic life. The state also intervenes directly in labor relations, regulating work in a manner that preserves hierarchy and productivity while suppressing collective action. Laws governing unions, strikes, and workplace conditions are often designed to balance the appearance of fairness with the maintenance of capitalist priorities, ensuring that workers' demands do not threaten profit margins or the authority of management. Even social programs and welfare policies, which might appear to mitigate inequality, are framed to reinforce dependence rather than empowerment, offering temporary relief while leaving structural exploitation intact. The state's function as a guarantor of inequality extends beyond national borders. International trade agreements, financial institutions, and diplomatic interventions often serve the interests of global capital, ensuring that wealth accumulation and exploitation are not confined to one territory but extended across nations. Colonization, neocolonialism, and economic imperialism are maintained through legal, military, and political mechanisms that reflect the state's role as an enforcer of class and power hierarchies on a global scale. Resistance to this reality often meets with repression framed as legal necessity. Protesters, labor organizers, and revolutionaries are criminalized, surveilled, or neutralized in order to protect the stability of the ruling class and the legitimacy of the state. The institutions that claim to safeguard rights and freedoms are deployed selectively, ensuring that the social order remains intact while dissenting voices are marginalized, silenced, or eliminated. Understanding the state in this light reveals that inequality is not incidental or unfortunate, it is the very purpose of the state's existence within a class society. Its structures, laws, and coercive apparatus are not neutral arbiters of justice, but instruments designed to maintain and enforce the domination of the few over the many. The state's legitimacy, its claims to neutrality and universality, depend upon the maintenance of this unequal order, and its functioning is inseparable from the perpetuation of systemic exploitation. Recognizing this reality is essential for those who seek liberation, for it demonstrates that reform alone cannot achieve justice, and that meaningful transformation requires the organization, consciousness, and collective action of those whose lives are constrained and shaped by the state's enforcement of inequality. Emancipation is not a gift to be bestowed by those in power, nor is it a reward granted by the institutions that sustain inequality. It is not achieved through patience, compliance, or incremental concessions that leave the structures of oppression intact. True emancipation is born of struggle, a conscious and sustained effort to confront the forces that exploit, dominate, and dehumanize. The oppressed must recognize that their suffering is neither accidental nor inevitable, but the product of a system designed to concentrate wealth and authority in the hands of a few while subordinating the majority. This recognition is the first step toward liberation, for it transforms resignation into awareness and despair into determination. Struggle in this sense is not merely physical resistance or sporadic protest, it is the organized and deliberate confrontation with the mechanisms of exploitation, whether they manifest as economic, political, or social oppression. The worker who strikes against unfair labor conditions, the community that organizes against displacement, the citizen who challenges laws that privilege property over life, these actions are all part of the broader struggle for emancipation. Struggle requires courage, discipline, and an understanding of the structural realities that sustain inequality. It is through struggle that individuals realize their collective power, that they see the connections between their own suffering and that of their fellow oppressed, and that they understand that liberation is inseparable from the liberation of all who are similarly subjugated. Solidarity is the indispensable companion of struggle. No individual, however determined, can dismantle systems designed to maintain hierarchy, enforce domination, and extract labor without the support and cooperation of others similarly committed to change. Solidarity transforms isolated grievances into a shared purpose, amplifying the strength of each participant and forging bonds that resist the divisive strategies of those in power. Through solidarity, the oppressed learn that their fates are interconnected, that the liberation of one requires the liberation of all, and that collective action is both a practical necessity and a moral imperative. This unity is not spontaneous but cultivated through dialogue, education, and sustained collaboration. It challenges the ideological forces that seek to divide workers along lines of race, gender, nationality, or skill, revealing the common interests that unite them and the shared enemy that exploits them. Reclaiming humanity is the third essential dimension of emancipation. In systems of exploitation, human beings are reduced to instruments, commodities, or numbers. Their creative energy, labor, and time stripped of autonomy and moral value. Reclaiming humanity involves asserting the inherent worth of each individual, recognizing that life cannot be subordinated to profit, and restoring dignity to those who have been devalued by oppression. It is both a personal and collective process, as individuals come to understand themselves as agents of change and as participants in a broader movement that seeks to reshape society according to principles of justice, equity, and freedom. Reclaiming humanity also requires the transformation of social relations, dismantling structures that perpetuate hierarchy and domination, and creating conditions in which cooperation, mutual respect, and collective well-being become the foundation of social life. Emancipation through struggle, solidarity, and the reclamation of humanity is inherently a process rather than an event. It demands continuous effort, reflection, and adaptation, as the forces of oppression are resilient and will resist attempts to dismantle them. It involves both confrontation and construction. The confrontation of entrenched power and the construction of alternative institutions, networks, and practices that embody the values of liberation. History demonstrates that every advance in human freedom has been secured through such sustained collective effort. No ruling class has relinquished privilege voluntarily, no oppressive system has dissolved without resistance, and no society has moved toward justice without the conscious and organized action of those most affected by inequality. Emancipation is inseparable from awareness of systemic exploitation, from understanding the mechanisms that perpetuate subordination, and from the strategic organization required to confront them. It is through struggle that the oppressed develop the capacity to resist, through solidarity that they multiply their strength, and through reclaiming humanity that they ensure their efforts are not merely reactive but transformative. Education, consciousness raising, and shared experience reinforce this process, enabling individuals and communities to articulate demands, plan actions, and envision alternative futures. The path to emancipation is marked by sacrifice, perseverance, and the willingness to confront entrenched power, but it is also enriched by the bonds formed among those who struggle together and by the affirmation of human dignity that emerges when oppression is recognized and rejected. Emancipation reshapes not only society but the consciousness of those who participate in it, fostering a sense of agency, purpose, and connection that cannot be secured through passive compliance. It requires the rejection of ideologies that justify inequality, the dismantling of institutions that enforce domination, and the creation of structures that prioritize human life, creativity, and cooperation over profit, hierarchy, and exploitation. In reclaiming humanity, the oppressed assert that their lives are not subordinate to the imperatives of capital, the whims of rulers, or the dictates of inherited privilege, but that every individual possesses intrinsic worth, agency, and the capacity to contribute meaningfully to collective life. Struggle, solidarity, and the reclamation of humanity are thus inseparable components of true emancipation, each reinforcing and sustaining the others, forming the basis for a transformation that is social, political, economic, and profoundly human, and that empowers the oppressed to move from subjugation to self-determination, from marginalization to agency, and from exploitation to collective liberation. The struggle for dignity, the recognition of exploitation, the awakening of class consciousness, the understanding of the state's role in maintaining inequality, and the pursuit of emancipation through solidarity and the reclamation of humanity, all these threads converge to reveal a single truth: freedom, justice, and human worth are never granted by those who profit from oppression. They must be seized through collective awareness, organized action, and unwavering courage. Every individual who refuses to accept subordination, who sees through the illusions of hierarchy, and who joins with others in the pursuit of equality, becomes a force capable of reshaping society. The path to liberation is neither easy nor immediate, but it is possible when the oppressed recognize their power, unite in struggle, and reclaim the dignity that is their birthright. The call is clear: no longer wait for permission, no longer accept exploitation as inevitable, and no longer measure human value by market forces or the consent of the powerful. In solidarity, through struggle, and by asserting the inherent humanity of all, the working class and the oppressed can dismantle systems of domination, challenge the foundations of inequality, and create a society where dignity, justice, and freedom are the inalienable rights of every human being.